Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to Small World and thank you for joining me with today's video. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to make a realistic Starbucks diorama in 1/24th scale. This project took quite a while to make, but I'm super happy with the result. I'll show you how to scratch build windows from styrene plastic, how to cut and make walls from foam board, add a wood finish, make an awning from styrene, make planters using real dirt, make miniature signs, add some greenery, and much more. Let's get started. First, I 3D modeled the design so I knew exactly what I was going to be making. This helps give me a clear idea of how the final product should look, and I modeled it in scale so I have the measurements that I need. Using my 3D model, I print out the windows, which gives me a template for scratch building them out of styrene strips. I simply just take one of the strips and line it up with the printed template below. Then, I use my X-Acto blade to score a line where I want to cut the strip, and then I can easily snap it along that score line. I repeat this process for each piece that makes up the window frame. When it's time to assemble the pieces of the frame, I line them up using the printed template. Then, I take some Tamiya extra thin cement and I brush it on the joint of the two pieces. This will soften the plastic and essentially weld the two pieces together. Once dry, I repeat this process for the rest of the window. Here you can see the frame lines up perfectly with the template, and I ended up making a total of 3 of these windows. I repeated this entire process again for all of the doors and windows of the building. First, I built the frame of the windows and doors. Next, I used some different sized plastics to make the doors. 3 pieces were made from 030 by 3/16 of an inch strips, and the bottom piece was 030 by ½ inch strips. Again, these pieces were just scored and snapped to fit the template, and then fixed in place with more Tamiya plastic cement. I had some quarter round pieces at the bottom of each door. As you can see, this method works for windows of all shapes and sizes. If you don't have a way to print your own templates, you can always measure as you go, or you can draw your own templates by hand. I've done this before, and the process is basically the same. Maybe one day I'll show you how to hand draw these details in scale in another video. And last but not least, this is the window for the drive-thru. Next, it's time to make the walls for these windows. I'll start by making these 3 walls highlighted in blue on the 3D model. To do this, I'm using a material that I've never worked with before. This is 1/8 of an inch thick PVC foam board. It's a dense board that has the same texture throughout, not like foam core with a soft center, and this cuts well with a sharp blade. Here's the piece that I'm using for one of the sides, and the first thing I had to do was transfer all of my measurements for the doors and windows to the wall. Here, you can see me measuring and drawing lines to determine the placement of these details. Here's how it looks with the lines drawn. Now, I'm cutting out the windows using a utility snap blade. Take your time with this step and use multiple passes to cut all the way through. I found it took me about 3 to 5 passes to cut all the way through depending on how much pressure I applied. Once you cut through all sides of the window, you can easily pop it out. And then you just repeat this process for all of the windows and doors. To be honest, this part of the process is one of my least favorite parts of making models, because it takes a lot of time to cut out all of these windows, and it can be easy to mess up and cut parts of the wall that you didn't want to. I find that precision in this step really tests my patience. Here, you can see the window frames test fitted in place, and they fit perfectly within the holes that we just cut. It's important to make sure everything fits together as you go along, so that way there's no surprises later on when you glue everything together. Again, the process is the same for the other walls, just transfer the measurements onto the board and cut out the shapes using a blade. Next, I added some panels made from styrene sheet above and below the windows. I just used some super glue to fix them in place, which worked out really well. I left a gap between each panel, which has been seen in my reference images. The gap is roughly a 32nd of an inch wide. I repeated this process for all of the walls. You can see me using either a piece of styrene or a metal ruler to ensure that the pieces I'm gluing down line up properly above the doors and windows. While this step is super simple, it actually is kind of tedious and time consuming. You have to be extremely precise with your application because the super glue dries almost instantly, and it's important to make sure that nothing is crooked or misaligned. Otherwise, you'll have to scrape off the panel and start over. The styrene pieces above the windows and doors are 3/4 of an inch tall, and the pieces below are a 1/2 inch tall. The lengths vary depending on the size and shape of the windows and doors. The process for cutting them was the same as before, just simply score and snap them to the right size. Here's how the walls look with all the styrene panels glued in place. Next, I'll be making the taller walls that look like they're made from several panels. I'll be using these pieces of black foam core to do this. This is the normal foam core that you can get at the craft store, not the PVC foam board I use for the other walls. I use my printed template to mark and cut out the door. Next, I'm scoring lines across the piece to simulate the panel lines on the wall. Again, take your time with this step and make sure your measurements are correct and that your ruler is lined up properly. Any imperfections can't be fixed and you'll have to cut a new piece of foam. I start by scoring the horizontal lines all the way across and then I move on to the vertical lines. This gives a nice grid pattern seen on the real building. I repeat the scoring for all the other walls that make up this part of the building. I glue in a piece of scrap PVC board to act as a door for this wall, and then I use some styrene strips to make the trim around the door. Here you can see I notched out one of the corners of the foam board to get a seamless edge when gluing the walls together. Basically, the back side of the foam board is removed, but the paper on the front side of the board remains. This way, the two pieces will line up perfectly at the corners. I use foam safe superglue to attach the foam pieces together, and also a metal 1-2-3 block to keep everything as square as possible. Here, you can see me notching out one of the corners. I'm cutting through the back side of the board, but not all the way through. Then, I stand the piece upright and flip it, and I use my blade to cut away the foam material from the back of the board. Be sure to take your time and not to cut through the paper on the front side. Now I'm removing the notch that I cut out, and I scrape my blade on the back side of the paper to remove any foam stuck to it. Next, I score the panel lines like before, and I glue it in place with the same foam safe superglue. Here's how it looks all together, and I primed the piece using Rust-Oleum filler primer. I make sure to do several coats, starting out pretty light and getting heavier with the following coats. Be sure not to oversaturate the surface with paint at first, as the solvents can either melt the foam underneath the paper or cause the paper to wrinkle and detach from the foam. Also, make sure to wear a respirator when spray painting. I know in the past that I usually use my airbrush spray booth, but this project is just too large, so I painted everything outside with spray cans. I primed the PVC foam board with Tamiya surface primer first. Make sure to apply several light coats over each wall. Once dry, I paint them with Tamiya TS67 for a dark gray finish. The PVC board has no issues accepting spray paint, so you don't have to worry about the solvent and the paint ruining these walls. Just make sure to build up the paint with several coats and do your best to avoid runs in the finish. I paint the styrene window frames using Rust-Oleum charcoal gray paint. Make sure to move the can quickly as you spray so you don't build up too much paint in one spot. This will help prevent runs and make sure that the details won't get clogged up with paint. Once the paint is dry, I start installing the window frames and doors using super glue. Since I test fitted all of the pieces before painting, this step was quick and easy since everything fit in place properly. After installing the window frames, I use Hobart face shield material which comes from a welding mask to simulate tinted windows. I glue the pieces to the back side of the walls using foam safe super glue so that way I don't have to worry about cutting them precisely. This material is probably not the most cost-effective way of making tinted windows, considering you probably could just apply a window film to cheap clear plastic like polycarbonate or polyester, but the material I'm using is just leftover scrap that I had from previous projects. I used to make some Star Wars helmets and I used a tinted welding shield for the visors. I had lots of leftover scrap material and it ended up working perfectly for these windows. I'm using foam safe super glue as it's not supposed to fog up clear parts. However, I did notice that it did fog up a little bit, but luckily for me it was only on the back side and not visible from the outside. Here's how the tinted glass looked once installed, and I'm super happy with the way that it turned out. Here I'm gluing these 3 walls together using super glue. I start by aligning and gluing one corner together, then I'll move on to the next corner. Most of the surface has a wooden finish and lots of the planks have lots of knots, so I'm using my X-Acto blade to emulate the knotted surface. I randomly just twist and turn my blade along the piece of wood. I'm using a 1/4 inch basswood strip that is a 32nd of an inch thick for these wood pieces. I stain the wood in a variety of different brown and black washes. For this one, I started with a light brown wash. Then, I went over it with a darker black-brown wash. This gets the wood to a more accurate finish to the real building, and it helps accentuate the wood grain and knot texture. Once dry, you can see that the finish is more toned down compared to when it's wet. I had to stain lots of these strips of wood, so I ended up painting several at a time. I did them in groups based on what color I wanted them to be. Some planks were lighter, some darker, some browner, and some more gray. As you can see, the wash absorbs super well into the wood. Don't worry if the strips start to warp. They'll flatten out just fine once they're cut and once you glue them in place. Here are the variety of colors that I achieved with these washes. I trimmed the planks to the right size using an X-Acto blade. If you have a chopper or a miter saw, this would definitely come in handy for making several pieces the same size. But I cut all of these pieces by hand since I don't have either of those tools. So don't be discouraged if all you have is an X-Acto blade. I attach each piece to the wall using super glue, and I just continue to work my way up the wall. This definitely took lots of time considering even the slightest offcut looked wrong since I was stacking up a straight line. Any deviation looked messy and I often had to recut pieces until I was happy with the fit. Even with this, it wasn't perfect, but I think it was good enough. When doing the corners, I did both sides at the same time to make sure each piece lined up properly. You can see that the planks butt up against one another at the corner, which is actually how they are on the real building. Here's how the progress looks so far, and I'm liking the way that things are coming together. We'll finish the rest of the wood texture later on. Next, I'm working on the metal panels that sit above the 3 walls that we've been working on. I plan on gluing the metal pieces to pieces of PVC board which will sit on top of the walls. I ended up 3D printing these metal pieces for my 3D model simply because it was the exact design and size that I needed. I'm considering buying some styrene sheets with a similar pattern of siding, but my local hobby shop was out of stock, and for the amounts of metal panels that I was going to be making, the cost in styrene would have been more than the cost of 3D print resin. I just glue the metal panels side by side using super glue until I have the 3 walls finished. I use styrene strips with an L-shaped profile which glue onto each corner of the metal walls. Also, I masked off the PVC board with masking tape so that it stays white after painting like it is on the real structure. I primed the surface using Tamiya surface primer again, and then I used the same TS67 gray spray paint by Tamiya for the color. Going back to the foam core walls that I primed earlier, I now apply several coats of Rust-Oleum Smoky Beige for the color coat. I'm a bit more heavy-handed with the paint as it's already been primed and I've waited a few days since. I also spray some styrene strips which will act as trim pieces for these walls, and I paint more foam core pieces with the Rust-Oleum primer that I cut for the roof. I glue the pieces for the roof using foam safe super glue. Add a few walls onto the roof using some more PVC board which I leave white. Then, I glued more strips of white styrene to clean up the edges on the top of the roof. Lastly, styrene strips painted beige were added to the tops of the walls. Now it's time to make the base for the model. I'm going to make it into 3 pieces, one main sidewalk piece that the building sits on, and 2 other planter areas that stick out forward. Here's the main sidewalk piece cut out, and it's the same PVC board that I used for the gray walls earlier, but it's a 1/4 inch thick instead of an 1/8 of an inch. This extra thickness was definitely much harder to cut by hand, but after several passes it finally cut all the way through. There are several planters embedded into the sidewalk, so I carved them out with a Dremel. I'm not trying to cut all the way through, I'm just adding a rough groove along the curb line that's marked. The engraving doesn't need to look pretty, it just needs to be there to act as a guide when I add dirt later. Make sure to wear a proper respirator and eye protection for this step. This puts out lots of dust and makes a huge mess as you'll see, so be sure to protect yourself. I repeat this step for all of the different planter spaces around the base of the diorama. Just take your time and do your best not to engrave past the curb line. Here, you can see me cleaning up the lines with the box cutter. I just cut along the curb line that I drew, and I peeled away any excess material that I didn't want to engrave with the Dremel. Here are the pieces after engraving. I know they look kind of messy, but again, you won't notice any of it later on. Now it's time to score all the lines for the curbs and the sidewalks into the base. I start by scoring the curb lines parallel to the edge of the base, offset by 1/4 of an inch. I use a metal ruler as a guide for straight lines. I use a pencil to roughly mark the line that I need to score for the curved lines. For the lines in the sidewalk, I use a metal ruler and I score the lines with the blade. I just work my way around the base doing this, adding lines based off of my reference images. Again, just make sure everything is aligned properly before scoring, so you don't add a line that's in the wrong spot or off at an angle. If you make a mistake, you'll have to fill the line with putty and sand it smooth. Once all the lines are scored, I install some handicap accessible ramps that I 3D printed. This is what I have so far. Here, you can clearly see the score lines that I added for the sidewalk. I do the same to add lines to the curbs of the two separate planter pieces. Just make sure you continue the score lines all the way around the curb. Next, I take all of these pieces outside and I paint them using some Rust-Oleum gray spray paint. This gray color will act as the base coat for the sidewalks and the curbs. Here's some tactile painting stones that I 3D printed. I'm painting these a nice yellow color, and I will add these to the bottom of the ramps that I glued onto the sidewalk base earlier. I'm just gluing them in place using some super glue. Now, I randomly apply some off-white gray acrylic paint to the sidewalk using a brush, and then I use a paper towel to blot and stipple the paint to a nice irregular texture. This helps bring a nice realistic pattern to the sidewalk, and it lightens it up a bit more. The sidewalks I'm replicating are fairly new, which is why they have such a bright, almost white look to them. I repeat this across the entire surface. Next, I go over the surface again with a dark brown wash, one of the same washes that I used to stain the wood pieces earlier. Like before, I just brush it onto the sidewalk and blot it using paper towels. This helps add some more subtle staining and weathering to the sidewalk. One part of the sidewalk had a massive irregular stain, so I tried to replicate it by leaving some of the wash in the selected area to dry. I know it looks a bit off, but once it dries, it'll be much lighter and it'll resemble the stained surface that I'm going for. Lastly, I speckle some of the same wash over the surface to add some more texture and imperfections. These do a good job of providing more interest to the surface and can even resemble chewed gum left on the sidewalk. Also, check out this tiny fruit fly that found its way onto the sidewalk when I was painting. At this scale, I think it would definitely make a realistic miniature roach. Anyways, I can finally attach the two sections of the building to the base. I'm just setting them down for the camera, but I ended up fixing them in place using some 2-part 5-minute epoxy. Now I'm making the drive-through window, and I made the simple piece using some more of the PVC foam board. I had some 3/4 inch styrene paneling above the window using super glue like before. I also cut out a countertop for more PVC board and a 3/8 inch squared styrene tube. All of these pieces were painted gray except the countertop was painted black. I glued the countertop in place using super glue, and then I glued the window frame on top of that. Then, the square tube was pressed up against the window frame on the corner. I added some more tinted glass material to the back side of the walls, and then I attached the drive-through to the building and the base. Once installed, I began to line the walls with more wood that I made earlier. This process is exactly the same as before, just gluing the strips on top of each other one at a time using super glue. And here's the finished drive-through piece. Now I can continue the wooden texture along the front of the building. There's a piece that needs to be added along the front of the beige piece first, and luckily this will cover up an ugly gap between the beige wall and the gray wall. Next, I just repeat the process of gluing the wood in place. I start by applying it over the exposed edge of the foam core. Then, I continue the texture along the gray PVC board until it reaches the window. Lastly, I add some more wood along the big foam core piece that I just added. I glue some pieces of wood all the way across, and I also break up some of the pieces to add some more realism and variety to the finish. Now, all the wood texturing is finally complete. Next, I'm going to make the awning that wrapped its way around the building. The main construction is again made from PVC board, and I split the awning into 3 main sections. The front has this triangle piece, and I painted the underside black and the top side gray. I glued this piece to the walls at the proper height using super glue. Then, I painted some 1/4 inch styrene squared tubes and glued them up to the base and to the awning along the edge. I used a 1-2-3 block to make sure everything was straight and square. I continue to add more PVC pieces around the perimeter of the building to complete the awning. Again, the bottoms of these pieces were painted black and the tops were painted gray. I then lined the edges of the awning with 3/4 inch PVC strips that wrap all the way around. I painted the back sides black and left the outside facing edges white. Don't worry about the bleeding black paint on the white faces. It will be covered up with the next step. Now I'm adding some styrene panels to the edges of the awning. This is the exact same process of adding the styrene panels above and below the windows from earlier. Again, I'm gluing them in place with super glue, and I'm leaving roughly a 32nd of an inch gap between the panels. I'm making sure that the panels are glued on straight and the corners butt up nicely against one another. And here's the completed awning. Now I'm starting to mask off the model to paint the awning. I mask off the large areas using some paper, and I secure the edges with Tamiya masking tape. In this step, you can see I added a wall under the left side of the awning that I built entirely out of styrene. I recorded the whole process, but unfortunately I somehow lost all of the footage. I essentially made a couple columns from styrene, and then I lined the columns with more styrene to emulate the paneled effect that matches the top of the awning. The only difference is that the styrene panels had to entirely wrap around the columns. It was very tedious and took lots of time and patience to get it to look right. But anyways, I just do my best to cover any part of the model that I don't want to get paint on with paper and masking tape. There's nothing too special about this step, other than it takes a long time and any mistake could result in paint leaking through. I like using this Tamiya masking tape because it lays down well and it rarely lifts paint from surfaces it's applied to. Once the masking is complete, I paint the awning with more Tamiya TS67 from the spray can. And here's how the awning looks painted. I was really happy with the way it turned out, and I think the gray paint finished it off nicely. Now it's time to make the signs. I 3D printed the letters on my 3D printer, and I printed out a paper template to get the spacing right. I'm laying them upside down and backwards along the template first. Then, I apply super glue along the bottom of each letter. I then take a styrene strip and connect all the letters along the bottom edge. I ended up making 2 of these signs, and here's how they look assembled. I painted them black and printed out some more of the same letters but much thinner, and I painted them white. Then, I glued the white letters on top of the black ones using the same super glue. Here are some more signs and menus that I printed out on a thicker cardstock. I scaled these down in Illustrator, and if you'd like to download a PDF copy for yourself, feel free to join my Patreon at the gold or platinum tiers. I cut out the circular signs using scissors, and I make sure to go slow to get a precise cut. I 3D printed a circular base for the sign, and I painted it black. I apply Mod Podge matte with a brush, and I stick the paper sign in place. And again, I made 2 of these. If you don't have a 3D printer that can make circles, I would just look around for any found object that's roughly the right size. Moving on to the menu boards, I cut the graphics out of the cardstock using an X-Acto blade and a metal ruler. This is the digital menu screen, and again, I modeled this in Fusion 360 and printed it on my 3D printer. Then, I just glue the graphic in place using Mod Podge like before. I repeat this process for all of the other menu boards. All of my 3D models for this project, as well as all of my other previous projects, are available for download on my Patreon for gold and platinum members. So if this interests you, feel free to check them out and support me by doing so. I'd really appreciate it. Anyways, if you don't have a 3D printer, don't worry. You could easily make these menu boards using styrene sheets and strips using the techniques I showed earlier in this video. It's just a big time saver to print these small details while I work on other parts of the project. I glue each of the menu boards to a small PVC board base. Here's how they turned out, and I think they look great. I spray mounted these drive-through signs to some PVC board and styrene using some 3M Super 77 spray adhesive, and then I cut them out with a sharp blade. Afterwards, I painted the white edges black using some cheap acrylic craft paint. I 3D printed these small security cameras, and I'm painting the domes gloss black by hand with a brush. I painted some styrene rods and strips silver, and I glued them to the back of printed parking signs. These are super simple and easy to make. I drilled a small pilot hole into the sidewalk base, and I glued the handicap sign in place using super glue. I also made some drain pipes with styrene tubes that I painted brown, and those were glued in place under the awning along all of the walls as well. I glued one of the Starbucks signs on top of the awning on the front of the building using super glue. Then, I added a drive-through sign underneath the awning beneath the Starbucks sign. Next, I drill more pilot holes into the sidewalk, and I glue more parking signposts in place. I add another Starbucks sign and a drive-through sign along the right side of the building in the same orientation as before. A small security camera, as well as another drain pipe, was added to the right side of the building on the front corner. I continue to glue my signs, pipes, and 3D printed details around the entire building in this manner. The placement and alignment was taken from the real-life references of this building. Here you can see a big super glue drip as I glued on the circular sign, but luckily I was able to quickly wipe the drip away before any damage was done. Again, I modeled these details in Fusion 360 and printed these out and painted them with the same beige color before installing. The awning above the side door was made from the same PVC board and styrene, just like the large awning was. Now I'm gluing some of the signs, menu boards, and small posts in place along one of the separate planter pieces. Now it's time to add dirt to the planter areas. I start by brushing on a layer of matte Mod Podge to the surface of the base. Then, I add some dirt onto the glue that I sifted from my garden. I spread out the dirt using a brush. Once I'm happy with the placement of the dirt, I soak the dirt using some isopropyl alcohol, which will break the surface tension for the next step. Once the surface is thoroughly soaked, I add watered down Mod Podge over the entire surface. This will soak through all of the dirt and lock it to the base once it completely dries. I know it looks super messy, but it's one of those things where you just have to trust the process. This building has lots of planters around it, so I just continue to add dirt, alcohol, and matte Mod Podge to everywhere that's needed. This took about 2 days to fully dry, but you'll know when it's dry when the dirt turns rock hard. It's still a bit mushy when it's wet. I used tacky glue to fix some bushes in place. The bushes that I'm using for this diorama are all from Diorama Pressape. I'm not sponsored by them, but I think they make amazing products, and I love using them in my models. I'll leave a link in the description to their website. For these little graph tufts, I'm simply hand applying some 12mm static grass onto the glue dots that I laid down. Here, I'm using another type of bush, again from Diorama Pressape. And this is how the model looks with all the dirt in place. I think it really helped tie the whole thing together. Here, I'm adding a frame that I made from styrene to the wall. The frame was made the same way as the window frames, and I installed some real window screen mesh behind it. Then, I'm gluing some more bushes up along it to simulate vines. Now, I'm adding one last ramp to the right side of the building using super glue. Next, I'm installing these railings, again made from styrene and window mesh. Lastly, I'm gluing the curb along the yellow tiles, which was made from a strip of styrene. And with that, the construction of the model is finally finished. This definitely took quite a while to complete. I had some delays getting the right materials for this project, and doing a cleaner architectural model like this makes it harder to cover up mistakes, meaning you need to be as precise as you can all the way through, which adds to the time and challenge of the build. Check out these shots of the model out in a local park. I love the way that it looks in natural light, and here are some 1/24 scale cars that I had lying around that I built a few years ago. I think they really add some nice realism to the scene, and the asphalt surface is just multiple pieces of foam core, so they're not permanently installed. The sidewalks just sitting on top of the foam core pieces. I'm actually sending this model to a fellow YouTuber that goes by the name of Preston Goes. He has some exciting plans for this project, so be sure to go and check out his channel and keep an eye out for it. I'll link his channel in the description below. Also, I want to give a big thank you to all of my Patreon members. Thank you so much for supporting me and my work and for making videos like these possible. Your support really helps cover the cost of materials for these projects, and I really appreciate each and every one of you. Again, if you'd like to support me and my work, please consider joining my Patreon. It would mean a lot to me, and in return, you'd get to see work in progress pictures of my projects as they're happening, downloadable PDF and 3D print files from this project as well as previous ones, behind the scenes Q&A videos, and much more. Well anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.